From New Zealand to Taiwan to Germany, some nations have earned praise for how they've handled COVID-19. What do these countries have in common? Women in the top job. And now research says female leaders have handled the coronavirus crisis better. Welcome to Roundtable. Hello there, I'm Shuli Ghosh. Coronavirus has hit different countries in different ways, but one group of academics say women leaders like Jacinda Ardern, Angela Merkel and Tsai Ing-wen have handled the pandemic more effectively, in most cases introducing lockdown more quickly and preventing more deaths.
Since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, the success of leaders such as Germany's Angela Merkel, Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan, and New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has attracted headlines. News stories about the record of women leaders soon led to academic research. A new study published by the Centre for Economic Policy Research and the World Economic Forum found that female-led countries had systematically and significantly better COVID-19 outcomes. Countries run by women had earlier lockdowns and suffered half as many deaths from COVID-19 compared to nations governed by men. The study found that communication played an important role, while women tend to show an interpersonal, empathetic and participatory approach. Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway, told her country's children, "It's okay to be scared when so many things happen at the same time." If female leaders have been performing better than men during the first phase of COVID, will we see the trend continue, and what can we learn from their leadership style?
A great topic to discuss. Let me introduce the experts today. Joining us on Roundtable from Liverpool, Supriya Garikipati, Associate Professor in Development Economics at the University of Liverpool. In New York, Stephanie Filion, a reporter specialising in politics and international affairs. And in Utah, Robin Hauser, Director of Documentary Films. Ladies, good to have you with us. Supriya, let me start with you and your study. Now, this is really interesting because it found that countries led by women tended to introduce lockdown faster, thus preventing more deaths. Was gender significant in that decision?
Yes, certainly. In our study, we find that female-led countries have locked down, depending on the specification we use, about 22 to 25 deaths sooner than male-led countries have locked down. And when I say male-led countries, I mean comparable male-led countries, countries that are actually very similar to the female-led countries that we have examined. So certainly, female-led countries seem to have been much more decisive about locking down their economies far sooner, significantly sooner than male-led countries.
Can I ask you a question about the way the study was conducted? Because when we look at how many women leaders there are in the world, there aren't very many, are there? There's something like 19. It's such a small sample. Does that mean your conclusions can be trusted?
So you're right. This number of female-led countries is really small. We had 194 countries in our full sample. So we started to wonder what we can do with this kind of data. Obviously, we could not employ the typical statistical methods that we use because of the small sample size. So we decided to use a very well-established methodology called nearest neighbor matching. What this literally does is takes a treatment country, which is female-led country, and matches it with the nearest male-led country. And the matching or the similarity comes from a variety of socio-demographic variables. So in the very first instance, we use variables like GDP per capita, which is national output, as you know. And we also use a host of demographic variables like population density, and elderly population, urban population. And when we match along these, we get matches that are very similar.
Stephanie, it's interesting because there are huge amount of stories, of memes about how well female leaders are doing compared to males. I know you've written a lot about this. Is this largely about how well female leaders communicate the issues as opposed to male leaders, perhaps?
Well, communication is, without any doubt, was extremely important during this pandemic. Look, if we do reverse engineer, for example, this situation, if we look at the countries that did worse when handling this pandemic, the United States, Brazil, the UK, they still are, high up on the list of the death per capita ratio. And if we look at the question of leading by example, so in the United States, we had President Trump telling people to wear masks when he didn't wear a mask himself. In Brazil, we had Bolsonaro really undermining the importance of the coronavirus pandemic. And I still remember seeing him among a large crowd very early on in the pandemic. So when you're trying to send a message that this is important, it doesn't really come across as important when you see leaders doing this.
Well, to be fair, Bolsonaro didn't think it was important, did he? He did not think that COVID-19 was something to be concerned about, whereas other leaders like Angela Merkel were saying, look, this is serious.
Yes, and I think that if you look at New Zealand, for example, and an example of effective communication, of course, when you look at Jacinda Ardern, when she was doing Facebook Lives, talking to people from her house, and she was sort of sending this message that, we're all in the same boat, and even us, we're not immune to this. And in the end, Boris Johnson was an example of this because he caught it himself. So I think that effective communication was really, key in handling this pandemic, but that is one of many factors that made women effective in handling the pandemic. That being said, yes, women did handle the pandemic well, but there are some countries right now that are led by women that are not doing as well as they did in the beginning. If you look at Bolivia, for example, they're not doing well. If you look at Belgium with Prime Minister Sophie Wilmès, they have a high number of death per capita.
Yeah, those are really interesting points, and Belgium in particular, and I do want to come back to that, and I will circle back round to that. I wanted to ask Robin that there are a lot of parallels for women in the world of politics and in the world of business and in the corporate world, and a lot of the times we look at things which are perhaps being really effective now, like empathy and communication skills, which are traditionally seen as lesser leadership qualities and are particularly ascribed to women. And I don't want to generalize because I know that is one of the problems that women face, that they are generalized as having a certain set of skills and men are seen as having another set of skills. And sometimes society thinks that those skills that men have make them better leaders.
Well, that's right. That's interesting. I mean, what we do know is that clearly there are differences between men and women, and especially when it comes to leadership, just in terms of stereotypes and the roles that stereotypes play. What we know from studies is that women are more risk adverse. Women also have higher EQ or emotional intelligence. Therefore, they might be more empathetic. And so when you take those qualities in terms of women leadership and you look at something like a pandemic, it makes sense that women leaders might have decided to, say, shut things down a little bit quicker because they, especially when it comes to death tolls and stuff, they might be more empathetic in terms of their leadership skills and also more risk adverse.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to bring up a documentary that you did called Bias, and you talk about something really interesting. You talk about the competence-likability dilemma. Let's take a look at a clip which explains it much better. It's a study by Harvard Business School 20 years ago where they wrote a case study on a hugely successful venture capitalist called Heidi Rosen. A few years later, they showed students the same case study, but they changed Heidi's first name to Howard. Let's take a look.
The only thing he changed, I think the one, other than the name and the gender, is I think somewhere in the case it said I was head cheerleader in high school, and so he changed that to quarterback of the football team. I think that was the only thing he changed. And then he taught the case in 2 sections, and then he asked the students to take a survey on both how competent is Heidi or Howard, whichever one you happen to have, and how much you would enjoy working with and for Heidi or Howard. And interestingly, his analysis showed that Heidi and Howard were deemed equally capable, but Howard was way more likable.
It's called the competence-likability dilemma that women but not men experience. What that means is that we either perceive a woman as likable or she's competent. And she's competent when she's assertive, when she's a leader, when she is like Heidi Roizen, but then we're less likely to like her.
So Robin, it appears, it's quite harsh, but that women can't be seen to be perceived as both competent and likable. Men can be both, but women, it's an either or situation. Why is that?
Yeah, sadly, because when women take on leadership qualities, which are to be assertive and decisive, we go against gender norms of what it is to be a likable woman, right? Women are supposed to be supportive and deferential, agreeable, and those aren't necessarily qualities that are valued in leadership.
Do people still think that? Who actually thinks women are still supposed to be deferential and submissive?
Well, believe it or not, even some women do. And now let me explain that before I get in trouble. But these are based on stereotypes, and they're deeply embedded unconscious biases. So even women tend to react somewhat negatively when they're around other women who are very confident or decisive or assertive, right? Even then we think, wow, she's a little harsh, or there are other words we use for women like that. And it's unfortunate, greatly, because we see the value, obviously, in women who are leaders. And when women are in leadership positions, we're very effective because we have that, empathetic angle as well to leadership.
Yeah, I can see both the other guests nodding at that. And I guess in our lives, our normal lives, ladies, we probably, all of us here, are quite assertive in our normal day-to-day lives. Supriya, do you think that it is the case that different qualities are assigned as being, acceptable according to gender? And if so, why on earth is that still the case? Why is it not changing in this day and age?
I think, different qualities should be embraced. I mean, leadership is contextual. Male leaders might be better at tackling some situations, but female leaders have certainly shown that they are better at handling this type of emergency that the pandemic has essentially presented. Perhaps because of their empathy, they seem to clearly have been more focused on saving the lives of their citizens as opposed to trying to save both lives and economies. And male leaders seem to have tried to walk that tightrope and sent out, as a result of it, mixed messages.
What about what Robin said about women tend to be less risk averse? When it comes to lockdown, the biggest risk is damaging the economy. I mean, that's a huge risk, which certainly leaders like Donald Trump didn't want to take, and Jair Bolsonaro didn't want to take. So in that situation, these women leaders weren't risk averse, at least as far as the economy was concerned.
Let me just clarify by saying what I said was that women are more risk adverse.
Sorry, yes, they are risk averse. And what I'm saying is that surely there's a risk to the economy. So when it came to that risk, they weren't averse. They went ahead with the lockdown. So how isn't that a dichotomy?
Absolutely. So economics, the whole risk attitude research in economics tells us that females are supposed to be more risk averse than men. But what we find is that they have actually taken risk and much more quickly than the men did. So in this instance, women were prepared to take the risk with their economy and not prepared to take risk with saving lives.
Okay. Stephanie, now you brought up this really important point, which I did want to discuss, which was that Supriya's study was done quite early on, where in the beginning stages of coronavirus, and some countries which were female-led, which did well in the beginning, are not doing so well now. One of the big ones, which I think you mentioned, is Belgium. one of the highest rates of COVID deaths for its population. I think it's just under 10,000 now. And the Prime Minister there, of course, is Sophie Wilmers. Do you think that that then undermines the argument that women leaders are handling the pandemic better?
I wouldn't say so, because I would say that overwhelmingly the women, we can say and we can look at the case studies of the countries that are doing better, and I would say they're overwhelmingly led by women. And also, when we look at this argument about the economy and about women being more risk averse when it comes, well, they were less risk averse when it came to the economy.
Well, they're willing to risk the economy more than the deaths of their population.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to say.
So I think the risk that they took ended up paying off when we looked at reopening the economy. And then I'm looking right now at some countries that are, taking some new measures to invite people to work in their countries, because right now they're doing well. So there was an article in the Washington Post around July looking at this, at some countries that are doing this, and 4 out of 5 of them are countries that either have a woman president or a woman prime minister. So we have here Barbados, Georgia, Estonia, Germany, and Costa Rica. So we can even see that the risk they took actually ended up paying off, because now they're doing better in terms of the pandemic, while some other countries are still suffering from it.
Let's talk about different styles of leadership. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro famously said about coronavirus, "It's raining, we're going to get wet. Some are going to drown in the rain." I mean, that's a very macho comment. We talk about strongman leadership. Is that a factor in how, well, it must be a factor in how various countries handled the coronavirus pandemic? I mean, Stephanie, you've talked about strongman leadership, and it's noticeable that those are the countries which have been slow to implement lockdowns or insist on masks being worn. Is that because of that style of leader?
Well, I do think it has an impact, because this pandemic, there was no playbook for it, right? It was unprecedented, and it was so hard to make decisions because there were so many unpredictable variables. So leaders had to make decisions, but they had to have sort of this global vision when making a decision. And I think that it required being able to listen, and it did require empathy, which is something we already talked about. So I do think that having these women who, are sort of maybe have these personalities who are more able to have these global visions rather than taking personal or political questions, maybe prioritize them, I do think it had an impact.
So
and maybe one thing I would like to add is that, myself having been in this world for many years and having, interviewed diplomats, politicians, what you see with women, and that's true for politics, but that's true for business and many other places, is that when you're a woman in politics, you have to go through so many stigmas, and there are so many more challenges. So when you reach that top office as a woman, it means that, you're so ready, you've worked so hard, because anytime you sit at that table, you need to be more ready than men, right? Because you have to
and I think that's something Robin can speak to. When we have companies and political circles and any sphere really where you have women at the top, is that beneficial for the organisation funneling downwards? Well, I mean, what's been the experience of arenas and environments where women are the leaders?
Well, I think absolutely. Anytime you have diversity of any kind in a leadership group, it's beneficial, right? Because you're not representing just one mindset. So you have, I think, diversity of gender, of religion, sexual preference, all sorts of things. That's incredibly important. And there have been studies that show that, women, say, are better investors, for example. Why? Because they're more risk aware. And we've been talking about risk adversity, and I think I mentioned it first, which is true. But people are beginning to talk about risk awareness.
Right.
Women will take risks often, right? But we just need to. We are aware of what the risks are before we proceed with making, say,
you see, the thing with that is that people might construe that as being more cautious. And in some circumstances, you want a cautious leader, and in other circumstances, you want a leader who's not afraid to make the hard decisions quickly? For example, what if it was a different crisis? What if it was a conflict or a dispute with a neighbouring country? In those circumstances, a lot of people, I think, anecdotally, would want to see or may prefer a strongman leader than an empathetic leader.
But not a rash decision, right? I mean,
right.
Things to come out very, obviously carefully and to calculate the various risks when you're making a decision. And yes, I think decisiveness is important, but only once it's well researched and once somebody knows exactly, what they're being decisive about. And I think that that's where a lot of the confusion came early on for countries like the United States, where we have a leader who, was not necessarily decisive about we had such mixed messages. We didn't really have leadership. Nobody knew where to turn to in terms of what to do or what the protocol was for Corona. And I think that proactive policy, that the study that we read was interesting in talking about the proactive policy responses of women versus men, and the attitudes of risk and empathy. And I think one of the key factors from my understanding was that empathy plays a really big role. And in this case, the women leaders tended to be more empathetic and therefore
men can be empathetic as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But in this case, I mean, if I read the study correctly, and I think Supriya is the one to discuss this, but it really shows that empathy did play an important role in saving lives. Now, what they're looking at is not the economic ramifications, but really how many lives were saved.
So empathy is obviously really important. This is a quote from Hillary Clinton. She says, "Women have been demonstrating the kind of inclusive, empathetic, science-based leadership that we should be trying to promote across the world." Let me come to you, Supri, because empathy, we talked about decisiveness and clarity and communication. Empathy is obviously a big part of that. Is there a problem about talking about things like empathy being largely in the province of female leaders? Does that entrench the sort of gender bias that we see?
Yes, I mean, I think we need to be careful about stereotyping these kind of traits like empathy. We have to recognize that men can be equally empathetic. But this type of behavior is much more apparent in women. I mean, there is interdisciplinary research that actually suggests this. So if you look at some research from neuroscience, apparently there are neurobiological underpinnings for gender differences that we find in empathy, which cannot just be put down to a cultural byproduct of socialization alone. So certainly we have to accept that men and women are different and have different feelings of empathy. However, I think...
So you mean it might be more biological rather than the way women are brought up, perhaps differently to how men are brought up?
Perhaps it is to do with differences in being brought up, nurturing nature, that kind of differences perhaps do matter. But certainly women do display more empathetic feelings than men do. But frankly, we need to encourage male leaders to adopt some of these traits that seem to be very important, other than, of course, primarily emphasizing the importance of diversity in leadership.
Stephanie, I mean, there's been such a lot of focus on this right now, I suppose rightly so, because the world is dealing with something that we haven't really ever had to deal with before. Do you think this could mean that the tide is turning and that we will now see more women taking on the top leadership roles?
I mean, let's hope so. It is hard to say definitely if it is the turning point for women in leadership, and we've actually seen in the last few years a backlash against women in positions of leaderships, and with those strongmen rising all over the world. But maybe that this pandemic is going to show that yes, in some situations, women can do a better job than men in leadership. But I think ultimately it's also, as my colleague said, it's ultimately calling for diversity in leadership, not only women, racial minorities, religious minorities, and also people with disability, because, those people, when they're brought to the table, they can really think about a whole of society approach, and that's what's really needed when dealing with these types of situations.
Yeah, and do you agree with that, Robin? I mean, that there's a need for more diversity, but are we at the point where that diversity is going to be nurtured?
Oh, I absolutely agree with it. And are we at that point? I hope we're moving toward that point. I mean, I think it's really important, but stereotypes takes a long time to dissolve or to change a stereotype.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what we deal with when we're talking about differences in leadership or acceptance of something that's outside the norm. But I think that the more we see women and racial minorities in leadership roles where they're successful, this is a good example, I think that's going to help change the stereotype.
Ladies, it was really great speaking with you. Fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Roundtable. And don't forget, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for TRT World Roundtable. But for now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.